what you'd predict, if you think it through, is that our discussion of the constructive bloodbaths would be ignored, because to reveal the fact that the media welcomed huge bloodbaths, as they did, would not be very conducive to the interests of power or to the media. It would also expose the fraud about the apparent anger over nefarious bloodbaths. So you'd expect the constructive bloodbaths to be ignored. As far as the benign bloodbaths are concerned, you might expect an occasional statement, since it's, the fact that the media ignored the benign bloodbaths doesn't show such terrible things. It doesn't, at least they didn't applaud them. And as long as you can exclude the role of the United States in being involved in them, not terrible, maybe a few odd comments. With regard to the nefarious bloodbaths, what you'd expect is fury and venom over the fact that the media, that the fabrications over bloodbaths of the enemy were exposed as a fraud. And that's important, and that can be used. It can be used, in fact, to defame the critics. See, if you show that people are lying about the crimes of official enemies, you can easily distort that into a defense of those crimes.
It's a failure of the imagination, an inability to see the world in terms other than those the establishment has set out for you. If you're not a Bushi, you're a Taliban. If you don't love us, you hate us. If you're not good, you're evil. If you're not with us, you're with the terrorists.
It's not the case, as the naive might think, that indoctrination is inconsistent with democracy. Rather, it's the essence of democracy. The point is that in a military state or a feudal state, or what we would nowadays call a totalitarian state, it doesn't much matter what people think, because you've got a bludgeon over their head and you can control what they do. But when the state loses the bludgeon, when you can't control people by force, and when the voice of the people can be heard, you have this problem. It may make people so curious and so arrogant that they don't have the humility to submit to a civil rule, and therefore you have to control what people think.
You write in Manufacturing Consent that it's the primary function of the mass media in the United States to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. What are those interests?
Well, if you want to understand the way any society works, ours or any other, the first place to look is who's in a position to make the decisions that determine the way the society functions. Societies differ, but in ours, the major decisions over what happens in the society, decisions over investment and production and distribution and so on, are in the hands of a relatively concentrated network of major corporations and conglomerates and investment firms and so on. They are also the ones who staff the major executive positions in the government, and they're the ones who own the media, and they're the ones who have to be in a position to make the decisions. They have an overwhelmingly dominant role in the way life happens, what's done in the society. Within the economic system, by law and in principle, they dominate. The control of our resources and the need to satisfy their interests imposes very sharp constraints on the political system and the ideological system.
When we talk about manufacturing of consent, whose consent is being manufactured?
To start with, there are two different groups. We can get into more detail, but at the first level of approximation, there's two targets for propaganda. One is what's sometimes called the political class. There's maybe 20% of the population which is relatively educated, more or less articulate. They play some kind of role in decision making. They're supposed to sort of participate in social life, either as managers or cultural managers, like, say, teachers and writers and so on. They're supposed to vote. They're supposed to play some role in the way economic and political and cultural life goes on. Now, their consent is crucial. It's one group that has to be deeply indoctrinated. Then there's maybe 80% of the population whose main function is to follow orders and not to think, and not to pay attention to anything. And they're the ones who usually pay the costs.
All right. Professor Chomsky, you outlined a model with filters that propaganda is sent through. That's way to the public. Can you briefly outline those?
It's basically an institutional analysis of the major media. what we call a propaganda model. We're talking primarily about the national media, those media that sort of set a general agenda that others more or less adhere to the extent that they even pay much attention to national or international affairs. Now, the elite media are the sort of the agenda-setting media. That means the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major television channels, and so on. They set the general framework. Local media more or less adapt to their structure.
World News. Gives a soundbite that says that there's a beachhead.
I think 628 is a good one.
Yeah, but I think 6 is a good start.
This is the operative soundbite for us. He's ours. He really knows how to time it.
We've got a minute for all the time, so that's...
I love this soundbite.
Okay,
and they do this in all sorts of ways, by selection of topics, by distribution of concerns, by emphasis and framing of issues, by filtering of information, by bounding of debate within certain limits.
2.5 minutes to air. 45 seconds.
They determine, they select, they shape, they control, they restrict in order to serve the interests of dominant elite groups in the society.
There is an unusual amount of attention focused today on the 5 nations of Central America.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
And quite generally, it goes right through history, intellectuals have been servants of power. Take, say, the First World War. On all sides, Germany, England, the United States, France, intellectuals were extremely enthusiastic about the war. There were a few dissenters, and the best known of them ended up in jail, like Bertrand Russell, for example, or Eugene Debs in the United States, or Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. Very small group of critics, some of them best known imprisoned. But most intellectuals were enthusiasts for their own country, and that's common, and it remains common. I mean, intellectuals write history, so you have to be a little cautious about what they say about themselves. We ask, what would you expect of those media on just relatively uncontroversial, guided free market assumptions? And when you look at them, you find a number of major factors entering into determining what their products are. These are what we call the filters. So one of them, for example, is ownership. Who owns them? The major agenda-setting media, after all, what are they? As institutions in the society, what are they? Well, in the first place, they are major corporations, in fact, huge corporations. Furthermore, they're integrated with and sometimes owned by even larger corporations, conglomerates. So, for example, by Westinghouse and GE and so on.
What I wanted to know was how specifically the elites control the media. What I mean is, I guess,
like asking, how do the elites control General Motors? Well, why isn't that a question? I mean, General Motors is an institution of the elites. They don't have to control it. They own it. You know?
Except, I guess, at a certain level, I think, like I guess I work with student press, and so I know like reporters and stuff.
The elites don't control the student press, but I'll tell you something. You try in the student press to do anything that breaks out of conventions, and you're going to have the whole business community around here down on your neck, and the university's going to get threatened, and I mean, maybe nobody will pay any attention to you. That's possible. But if you get to the point where they don't stop paying attention to you, the pressures will start coming, because there are people with power. There are people who own the country, and they're not going to let the country get out of control. So what we have in the first place is major corporations which are parts of even bigger conglomerates. Now, like any other corporation, they have a product which they sell to a market. The